All right, let's loosen you up a little bit. I want you to turn to a neighbor, and I want you to tell them one thing that made you angry this week. Oh, yeah. And now if it's your husband or wife, be careful. One thing that made you angry this week. All right, I'm going to bring us back around. I've got a list of some things. Maybe if you want to, maybe if this applies to you, you can raise, you don't have to raise your hand. Maybe you want to. Maybe you got cut off in traffic by a terrible Memphis driver this week. Anybody? That happened to anybody this week? Maybe your DoorDash order was wrong when you got it. Anybody? Yeah, that happened to me this week. Maybe a coworker said something offensive or insulting. Ooh, that's a little harder to deal with. Maybe your boss piled extra work on your desk with no extra time. Looking at you, Barrett. All right. Maybe your wife did something, your husband did something, your kids did something. I'm going to refrain from that because my wife and kids are all here. I never thought I was an angry person. And then I had kids, and I realized I'm a very angry person. Can anybody relate to that in the building? There is a level of I just didn't know I had that kind of aggression in my spirit. It wasn't until I had kids that I have this habit where if I get really angry, I will clench my jaw really tight. And almost grind my teeth. I don't know if anybody else does that. When you're angry, maybe your shoulders, they get real tense. Your head gets hot. Maybe you can't see straight. Maybe it's just red, that's all you see. Maybe there are words that come out of your mouth faster than you thought they could or should. Maybe there are words that shouldn't come out of your mouth. Maybe you yell. Maybe you scream. Maybe you shut everyone out. A lot of people do that. I'm angry, I'm going to crawl in my little hole and I'm not going to talk to anyone. Maybe you decide relationships with others aren't worth it and you close yourself off. Whatever the response, the point is this: anger is universal. It's universal. All of us find ourselves angry at some point or another. Now, we've discussed this before, but anger isn't always a negative emotion. Anger is actually very helpful to us sometimes because anger reflects passion. If we're angry about something, then there's a deep sense of emotion. We're passionate about that. And if anger is directed correctly, it actually leads to action, right? If I'm angry enough about something, I will do something about it. But if we're not in tune with our anger, or if we don't live in self-control of our anger, it can easily turn into bitterness, into resentment, and it can overwhelm our entire personality. You know some of these people. Maybe you are one of these people that's just always angry. Always upset. They walk into the room and you're like, what are they going to complain about or be frustrated about today? You see, if we're not careful, anger can overwhelm everything that we are. With anger as an emotion, it acts as a guiding system for us in how we navigate relationships and circumstances. So the question we have to ask this morning, if we know it's universal, we know it's a universal experience, then how does Jesus address it? All of us are in the same boat. Maybe some of us are angrier than others, but all of us experience anger. So how does Jesus address it? Today's message is it's simple. Letting go of anger, holding on to Jesus. Letting go of anger, holding on to Jesus. And I'm going to go ahead and give you the main point, and then we're going to walk our way through it, okay? The main point today. The key to letting go of anger and living in forgiveness on a human level is to ground it in God's forgiveness of us through Christ. The key to letting go of anger and living in forgiveness on a human level is to ground it in God's forgiveness of us through Christ. And that leads us into Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21. We'll read 5 verses. Jesus is preaching and he says this, "You have heard it said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to counsel, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come back and offer your gift. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then offer your gift." He goes on in verse 25, he says this, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." I want to break this down as we go, and I want to talk just really simply today about the standard that Jesus is setting. He's looking at the people and he's saying, listen, you've not only heard this, but you've applied this to your life. He's talking about basically the command of in the 10 Commandments, right, of the law, thou shalt not kill. He's looking at them and saying, you've heard this and you've lived by it as the standard, right? You've heard that this was said even to those of old, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be liable to judgment. Jesus makes it clear from the jump that anger is universal. He argues that for too long, the guideline has been just do not murder. Basically, as long as I don't physically kill someone, then I am not a murderer, right? And I think we read this, and I don't think any of us walking in today would necessarily classify ourselves. If we were to give an identity of ourselves, we'd have been like, yep, that's me, I'm the murderer, right? That's not really something we walk around with and believe or even see in our own lives because, whether people realize it or not, I think it's actually an incredibly low bar, maybe not to kill another person. That may be debatable in some circles, but I think you can actually do pretty well to go your whole life without physically murdering someone. But what's difficult is Jesus actually sets the standard. He's not telling us something different from the law that's already established. He's actually challenging the people to see that the law of the Lord has to go deeper than the physical. It actually moves into the spiritual. God's law is a spiritual law that requires you to look in the deepest parts of your heart and acknowledge what's present there. He says, Everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. All of a sudden, that opens this case wide open. This crowd that was listening to him, they had all puffed themselves up and said, I'm not a murderer. And then all of a sudden he says, well, actually, if you've even had anger at your brother or your sister, you've lived in anger towards another human being, you actually are liable to be judged as a murderer for that. You see, Jesus is setting the standard that judges the heart, the motive, the thoughts, not just the action. He's pushing the truth of the law further into our hearts and asking us really to evaluate it, to evaluate what's present there. If I ask you today, take a little bit of time, as you hear what Jesus is saying, is there any bit of your heart that's harboring this anger, this bitterness, this resentment? Because Jesus is talking to you today. Again, it's easy for someone to go through life without physically murdering another person, but to walk in peace with others always without anger, man, that seems impossible. It's that scene from Moneyball. It's incredibly easy. It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. The text goes on to say, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. These insults, they're not like you're joking around with a buddy insults, or the silly name calling. Maybe you grew up in school hanging out with people. No, this is the insult that clearly puts you on a pedestal and someone else lower. This is the type of insult that as you're quarreling with somebody, you puff yourself up and you take a dig at them so that they feel less than human. This is also the conversation like when you're in conflict with someone and maybe you're telling someone about it and you maybe exaggerate a little bit more of what this person did or said so that you feel more righteous. Anybody ever done those things? I know I have. When I feel wronged, buddy, I'm gonna examine every piece of what someone's done. And if there's even a possibility of it being wrong motive, I'm just going to assume that's what it is. Because it makes me feel more holy, more whole, more righteous. And it allows me to condemn that person for what they did even more. Jesus is telling us, listen, whoever does those things, you'll be liable to the council. And if that's not enough, you go ahead and you demean someone's value, the very value that I placed on them from the beginning, that imago Dei value, that image of God that everyone carries around, no matter race, no matter orientation, no matter sexuality, no matter what. You demean someone to that level, then you're not just being judged by counsel. He talks very clearly here. You're liable to the hell of fire. He's basically saying, I do not have time for this. That leads to destruction. When we have the perspective of others that puts them lower, that insults their very being, that makes them less than human, then that is the path to destruction for us. He speaks very clearly to these people. What can we do to discredit someone else's position when we're fighting with them? What words or tone can we exaggerate? What words can we dissect to find some hidden offense? What names or insults can we hurl that way to make us feel better about ourselves, the situation? We do this all the time. This type of anger goes beyond the cut off in traffic anger. My order is wrong on the drive-through line, or my kid ruined the new shoes kind of anger. This is anger that we stew on. As a matter of fact, there's multiple types of anger found in the New Testament, but there's two that I want to talk about today. And the first is this idea of thumos. It's this anger that's like this quick, hot, short-lived anger, right? It's the anger that you feel when your favorite quarterback throws an interception and you get so mad and you're angry and you shout and then it's over and you calm down. It sparks up, but it dies down quickly. All of us experience this, right? But then there's this second type of anger. This orge is how it's pronounced. It's this vengeful, seething resentment held over a long period of time. I look at it kind of like one of my favorite things to do to relax is to build a fire. Anybody else love sitting around a fire? To build a fire, you have to have multiple types of wood or multiple types of fuel to be able to do it well, right? You have to have some of these like quick spark, dry type of things that light really quickly, but then go out. Then you also have to have wood that it's best if the wood has been seasoned, meaning it's dry, it's ready to actually receive the fire because it's gonna take that fuel, that fire, and it's actually gonna allow it to consume itself, and it's gonna light, but it's gonna be very slowly and intentional. I even think when you're building a fire, I'm not very good at it sometimes, so you gotta like blow on the fire. You have to produce the oxygen needed so that the fire can grow. You have to tend to it. That's this type of anger. It's one that you're actually giving energy to. You're actually stoking the flames of it by living in it. You're trying your hardest to cultivate it, to get bigger and bigger and bigger because you are actively living in this idea of this getting bigger. There's a term in navigation called dead reckoning. Anybody know that term? A little bit? Dead reckoning it's going to be somewhat complicated to explain, and I'll probably do a terrible job, but here it is. Sometimes when you have no landmarks, you have no astrological patterns that you can see in the sky, you maybe not know where you are, right? You actually got to set a course first to get somewhere. And a dead reckoning is basically like there is a point on a map. You know that at one point at a certain time you were here at a map. Say it's 7 o'clock. And you were at this point latitude, longitude-wise. You don't know anything else. But you've been told, hey, set a course for 35 degrees, whatever. Set a course this way. And then they're going to come over and say, well, can you give me your dead reckoning? Where do you think you are? Right? And so you've got to keep track of your speed. You've got to keep track of the direction you're going in. And then you can give an educated guess of where you are based on your speed and how long you've been going. Right? Because you knew the starting point. That's the basics of dead reckoning. The problem with the dead reckoning is if you're not intentional about recording those things, or if you're not intentional about knowing all the details and having the control that you need, one of the biggest problems that happens is drift. Because if you're not intentionally making sure that you are at the right degrees, going the right way, or if it's the right time, or your speed's at the right place, then all of a sudden you end up being Christopher Columbus, thinking he's found India and he's really in America, right? You've drifted. The same is true with this second type of anger. The second type of anger takes us off course, and it requires the greatest amount of attention to eradicate. You see, we believe that we can actually use our anger to get us somewhere profitable. But the Bible actually tells us that Our anger will get us somewhere, but it's going to drift us from where we actually think we're supposed to go. It says the same is true with anger. When we let it rule our hearts and our lives, we sail into the direction we think we need to, but we drift and we end up somewhere different. James chapter 1, verse 19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Psalm 37:8. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil. We take anger and we plot it on that chart and we say, we're going to make a path from this anger and we're going to get what we want. The Bible tells us that we will end up in destruction. The Bible tells us it only leads to more evil. It only leads to greater destruction. It does not serve you. Jesus goes on in verse 23, and he gives a practical example. He says, so if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Can I ask the question this morning? Serious question. What would it look like if we took this verse 23, we took that seriously this morning? Today, in this place of worship, how many of us right now need to get up out of our seat, need to leave this place, and go be reconciled with our brother and sister? That's not a hypothetical question Jesus is asking. This is a teaching that he is saying. He's saying, friends, if there is someone that has something against you, it is time for you to get up, to leave this place. Leave your sacrifice, your offer here, and go be reconciled to your brother. You can come worship when it's done. What do you think? We took that seriously. We can end the sermon right now if we need to. I mean, we can take, maybe it's half of us. Maybe it's a few of us. What would it really look like for us to say, all right, Lord, I'm just simply going to follow what you say. I've got to go be reconciled. I've got to be the first mover of that. He tells us then in afterwards, I think this is really interesting. It says, if your brother has something against you. Why make that distinction? If your brother has something against you. He doesn't say if you have something against your brother. He says if your brother has something against you. You would think that, either way, Jesus would want us to be reconciled, right? So why not say the whole thing? We see Jesus' teaching, Matthew 5. We've already gone over this a couple weeks ago. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. We see in Ephesians 4:32. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. So why make this distinction? I think there's a reason. I think that Jesus makes the distinction between conflicts because he assumes that we are already walking in forgiveness towards others in accordance with his teaching. I think Jesus is assuming that if we have something against our brother, we've already taken care of that because of what he's done for us. I think he's like, I don't even have to teach about that because you already know. Maybe some of you in here this morning, you came and there is something you have against somebody in your life. Here's what I'm telling you. Jesus has already assumed that you are living in forgiveness of that person because you are someone who has been forgiven. So you are in the wrong if you are harboring something against someone in this place today. Because you've been forgiven much. Those who have been forgiven much, forgive much. Amen? And so he makes this distinction so that he assumes, hey, you should be living in a way where your side of the street is clean. Your side of the street, you have no ill will towards anyone because you are a forgiven human being who then overflows that forgiveness to others. Just as Jesus first loved us, while we were still enemies of God, we are called to be the first movers towards forgiveness. This is not fun, to be the first mover towards forgiveness. This is where it gets difficult because there are times I do not want to forgive. There are times I feel incredibly insulted, impacted, frustrated, hurt. Can I just tell you, I've been in counseling like 3 years, right? Which is, small. It's not a long time. But it took me 2 years to even recognize that hurt was an emotion that I felt. Because I didn't want to feel hurt. I didn't want to actually say, this hurt me. This impacted me. This is hard. I don't like this. I didn't want to admit that someone had that type of control on my life. I didn't want to admit that a situation was hurtful to me. But we are called to be the first movers of forgiveness. And this is a discipline even more than it's an emotion. Tim Keller talks about you forgive as an obedience to Jesus before you even feel the emotion of forgiveness. Like, this is an obedience that we're walking in. I heard someone say one time, and I may have told you this phrase before, emotions are like children. You can't let them drive, but you can't put them in the trunk either. Right? If we are just going to be people who let our emotions drive, do what we feel all the time, then we are not going to be forgivers. We can't always let the things that we feel drive us. We actually have a driver. His name is Jesus. He's going to take us where we need to go. We have to let him drive. But he's also not saying, hey, stuff your feelings back there. We don't ever have to talk about them. No, he's saying, like, you can sit in the back seat. You can be that annoying Uber passenger that just talks my head off, right? Just talks and talks and talks. You just give it over to me, and I'll take care of it. Give it over to him. He is the driver of those things. The question you have to ask yourself today, and the question I have to ask myself is this: what if I don't want to take Jesus' words seriously? What are the consequences of living in unforgiveness? Maybe you're asking that. Maybe you want to hold on to that resentment, that anger you have. I'm going to give you 3 good reasons to listen to Jesus this morning. Number 1, we let go of anger and we forgive other people because God, Jesus, commands it. Simple. This is that classic, like, the Bible says it, so I'm going to do it. I know that's a simpleton way of thinking, but in all honesty, if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, then if Jesus says it, we do it. At the end of the day, we're not followers of a religion. We're not followers of a church, followers of a set of beliefs, or followers of ideas. We are followers of Christ. Where he leads, we follow. What he teaches, we do. What he does, how he lives, we live. Do you want to be a follower of Jesus? You have to obey his words. That's the first reason. Matthew 6:14 and 15. For if you forgive their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive, their trespasses. The Heavenly Father will not forgive your trespasses. Later in Matthew, in chapter 18, Peter looks at Jesus and he's like, well, how many times do I have to forgive? 7? Is 7 enough? Please, just give me an answer. I need to write it down. I need to keep a record of how many times I've been wronged. And Jesus looks at him and he's like, nah, how about 77 times? How about that many? Basically, it's going to be so many times you're not going to be able to keep count, so you just might as well keep forgiving. Right? Keep forgiving. I had a moment, this was years ago now in my life. Some of y'all know a little bit about my family. I've got a brother that I love dearly. He's one of my best friends. He's 6.5 years older than me. And about 10 years ago, he called me and admitted that he was a drug addict to me. And all that unfolded afterward was like really messy. He got found out at work. His wife found out. All our family found out in the most public way. And it was awful. It was an awful experience for everybody, including especially his wife. He ended up going to a rehab program here in Tennessee and was there on his 30th birthday. And we got to visit him. He had been there about 30 days. And we got to visit him on his birthday. And it was me, my mom, and my sister-in-law. And, I'll never forget that day. The last words that my sister-in-law had told my brother before he left to go into this program was like, basically, you're dead to me. I don't want you to be my husband. I don't want you to be the father to our children. I want a divorce. I want all this to go away. And so going into that day, no doubt my brother had replayed, those tapes, those words, those things over and over and over again for, I think it was 30-something days before we had seen him. And when my sister-in-law got there, and they don't mind me telling the story because there's redemption in this, and God works. But when she got there, she was very just cold towards him. She was still in a place of real anger, and to be honest, righteous anger. She had a deep passion for their family, and she felt like she'd been wronged. And I remember we got there, and I'm thinking, oh, this is going to go great. We're all going to be together. It was a disaster. I mean, my sister yelling at my brother, my mom yelling at my sister. I'm like a new pastor, so I'm trying to pastor people and remind them of the truth. And I'm like, I didn't sign up for this. This is crazy. But I'll never forget at the end of the day, I sat down in a stairwell with my sister-in-law, and I just looked at her and I said, tell me what you're feeling. And she said, I am angry. And I said, you have a right to be angry. I said, it's a feeling at this point. You feel angry. I get it. I said, but there's going to come a time, it may not be this week, it may not be next week, but there's going to come a time where you're going to wake up and the feeling of anger will be gone, and you'll have a choice to make. You'll have a choice to be angry or to forgive. And I looked at her and I said, do you love my brother? Big tears come to her eyes, and she says, I love him. I said, even in your anger today, I said, before you leave this place, he needs to hear that you love him. I said, doesn't mean you're not angry. Doesn't mean it's not hard. He needs to hear that there's a love and there's a path forward for him. I let it go. I let them go. And one of the coolest things, a year later, my brother, who had called me afraid he was going to lose his marriage, his family, his job, everything. A year later, we're celebrating his birthday lakeside, over a year of sobriety. Now he's over, I think, 10 years of sobriety. We're celebrating his birthday, and I said, could you have ever dreamed that as of your last birthday where you were, that this birthday would look like this, with a marriage that was stronger than it had ever been, with children that loved him, with a family that accepted him for who he was. Could you have ever have dreamed it? He said, no. And I said, that's what God does. That's what God does. If we're willing to walk in obedience to Jesus in forgiveness like my sister-in-law was, then God can take it and do the rest. God can take it and do the rest. We forgive 77 times, not just 7. Second reason that's good to follow and listen to Jesus is this. We let go of anger and forgive others because Jesus has forgiven us. Colossians 3:12 through 15. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so also you must forgive. Colossians goes on, and above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called to one body, and be thankful. We also get the warning again in Matthew chapter 18. It goes on, and Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. Anybody remember this? There's a servant who owes the master like 10,000 talents, and the master decides he's going to lock the servant up. The servant falls to his knees. He pleads with the master, and the master has pity on him, and he says, all right, fine, your debt's forgiven. You can go and be free. And the servant just like gets up, all joyous. It's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I've been forgiven so much. He walks out, and then he sees someone who owes him a much less sum. Like, I forget what it is. I think it's like a crazy amount less. And he says, hey, where's my money? And the guy gets on his knees. He's like, I don't have it. Can you please have pity on me? And what the servant done is he beats the guy up for his money. And the other servants around, they see what happens, and they go tell the master, and they're like, bro, this is just what happened on the steps. The master brings the servant back in and basically says, hey, you were forgiven all this amount, and you couldn't forgive someone for this? Fine. We're going to send you away. You're going to live in prison until basically the rest of your days. This is the metaphorical story of what we do on a day-to-day basis when we can come in here, we can raise our hands, we can shout and proclaim that we have been forgiven, but we walk out into the world and we do not forgive others. We live with anger and resentment towards others. We are no better than the servant who has been forgiven all but will not forgive little. There are steep consequences for us if we do not forgive the way that we have been forgiven. The third reason to listen to Jesus is this. We let go of anger and forgive others so that the evil done to us does not control us. Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I remember the last time I was just talking to someone today. It has been, this is a fact that you may not know, I have a couple of tattoos. I want a new tattoo. I don't know if anybody is on board with me on that. But it's been a long time since I got a tattoo. The last tattoo I got was actually, I got my wedding ring tattooed on my finger because I'm terrible with jewelry and I lost my wedding ring probably 10 times our first year of marriage. That's another story for another day. But as I was in the tattoo shop, this was now 12 years ago, I'll never forget this story, and it applies to us today. There was a lady that had come in, and she was sitting across the room from me, but she was one of those really loud talkers, and so I could hear everything that she was saying, and it was just impossible not to overhear, and you were like really intrigued with what she was saying. And the tattoo artist was asking her, she was getting a bird, or I think a couple of birds like tattooed on her arm. And he was like, hey, you want to tell me the significance of this? And she's like, well, sure, I'll tell you. She said, when I was 12 years old, my stepfather murdered my mother. Yeah, didn't see that one coming. I know, sorry. Stick with me, gets better. She said he went away to prison he's got a life sentence. And she said, I basically saw it happen. And she said, I've lived the last 20 years and I haven't spoke to him. I haven't wanted to look at him. I haven't been in any contact with him. And she said, just recently, I've just been stuck in my life, and I've had some spiritual guidance from some people, and the person told me maybe I need to just go and talk with him. She said, so I went to the prison one day with it was either a priest or a pastor, I don't remember. And she sat down with her stepdad, who she hadn't seen in 20 years. And as she was sitting across from him, she realized that what she had held on to in unforgiveness was actually the very thing that was controlling her life. She couldn't actually move forward because she was holding on to this past point in her past. And I remember, like, at this point, she's telling the story, and I'm all in, right? And she said, I just remember sitting across from him, and I had no intention that day of doing this, but I looked at him, and I told him that I forgave him. And I meant it. I forgave him for what he did, and he's no longer going to have, I'm no longer going to keep it against him. I'm going to have boundaries, of course. He's not my best friend or someone that I'm, but I forgive him. She said, and I truly meant it. And there's just this wave of just relief that I hadn't felt in years come over me. She said, so as I'm walking out of the prison, all of a sudden the sun is really bright, and there are these birds that are just like so loud. She's like, it's like the loudest birds I have ever heard in my life. And she looks at her pastor and her priest or whoever, and she's like, do you hear those birds? Like, they're so loud. And her pastor says very gently, very quietly, maybe this is the first time in 20 years that you've been able to hear the birds. Maybe this is the first time in 20 years that you've actually been able to hear the goodness in the world. We have to let go of we have to let go of anger, and we have to forgive, because there is only one thing meant to control us, and that is Jesus. If we hold on to our anger, if we hold on to our anger for others, if we hold on to our resentment, friends, I promise you, it will take the steering wheel of your life, and it will bring you to a place that you do not want to go. It will not bring you the deliverance that you are hoping for. It will not bring you the satisfaction that you desire. The only one that delivers and the only one that satisfies is Jesus. If all of this feels too difficult or impossible, maybe it's impossible to wrap your heart and your head around it. If it feels like it's going to take time and effort to implement this into your life, then congratulations, you're in good company. You're in good company this morning. It's incredibly simple. It's also incredibly difficult. Forgiveness does not come naturally to us. God has to work in us and through us so that we can rely on the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives. We actually get to follow his footsteps in letting go of anger and walking in forgiveness. We don't just listen to a great teacher that teaches this sermon on the mount and says, go and do likewise. No, he teaches this sermon and then later he walks it out in his life. He has not only told us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, but he has displayed it to the very ones who nailed him to the cross. The ones who beat him, mocked him, spit at him, he asked God to forgive them. Even more so, the very reason he was on the cross, it wasn't a physical burden of weight. It was the spiritual weight of your sin, of my sin, pressed upon his shoulders. He carried and he buried it by his own greatness and his own power. We have been forgiven, and he has put to death the sin and the offense that we were to God, so that we could be in communion with him forever. Not by our work, not by our actions. Jesus was the first mover. In word and in deed. He's been the first mover. He continues to be the first mover. If you want to be the first mover in forgiveness, it's going to come by the power of the Holy Spirit, not by your own will or by your own emotions or by your own desires, but by your willingness and your ability to surrender your life and let Jesus lead it. That's how you forgive. That's how you let go of anger. The key of letting go and to forgive is on a human level, is to ground it in God's forgiveness of us through Jesus. Simple, yet difficult. My encouragement today, as the band's going to come up and start playing, is this. I think there are some real relationships and conflict in the room, or things in your heart and in your mind right now, and you say, I have been holding this for too long. I have been letting this control me. I've been letting it control my outcomes, my futures, my emotions, my perspective for too long. It is time for anger to take the back seat and for Jesus to drive. I believe that it may not be today, but this week there's some real work that gets to be done in this church this week. There may be some text messages, some phone calls, some face-to-face coffee meetups where you say, I've been holding on to this anger for you for too long, and I'm willing to let it go. I tell you that, guys, not as someone who's not lived it. I never thought I would be back in this church. I never thought I would be standing on this stage again. 2017, I left this church hurt and mad, frustrated, and angry. It took years for me to figure it out, acknowledge it, and be able to let go of it. I mean, God is so good. By the time that I was really ready to let go of my anger, I remember looking at our pastor, Barrett, in the face. I remember looking at others in the face and telling them all the ways I felt hurt. And I also remember looking at them and saying, here's all the ways I know that I hurt you. And in that moment, guys, I'm telling you, there was this incredible moment where we all looked at each other and we saw the forgiveness of Jesus in each other's lives. And all the things that had been done, we knew that they had been done. We put them to rest. And we put them to bed. We buried those things in the righteousness and the forgiveness of Jesus. And we got to see what God is doing. And in this place now, because the willingness for men, young men, to walk in forgiveness, just as they have been forgiven, we get to do the work of ministry in this place, not just in this church, but in another church in a new season. That's the power of the Holy Spirit. That's the power